Most people think they understand vegetables. They think nutrition is settled science. They think if something really mattered, it would already be on grocery store end caps, pushed by influencers, fortified into cereals, or wrapped in a glossy superfood label with a premium price tag. And that assumption alone is why one of the most powerful budget-friendly roots in human history has been quietly erased from modern diets. Because this isn't a trendy berry flown in from the Andes. This isn't a supplement with a celebrity endorsement. This is a root that once fed Roman emperors, sustained armies, survived famines, and quietly outperformed vegetables we're told are essential. And it's still sitting there today, overlooked, misunderstood, and wildly underused. I'm talking about rutabaga. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another history lesson or nutrition fluff piece, let me be very clear about what makes this video different. I'm not repeating what you can read on the back of a seed packet or skim from a health blog. I've grown this root. I've cooked it every way imaginable. I've tested it against modern staples. I've looked at the nutrient data instead of the marketing. And after years of watching hype cycles rise and crash, rutabaga remains one of those rare foods that actually delivers nutritionally, economically, and practically without asking for attention. The shocking part isn't what it does. The shocking part is how thoroughly we've been trained to ignore it. Here's the first truth bomb most people aren't ready for. By weight, rutabaga contains roughly 4 times more vitamin C than carrots, depending on growing conditions and freshness. Not double. Not slightly more, 4 times. And yet carrots are marketed as the gold standard. They're everywhere. Juice bars, school lunches, fitness meal plans, rutabaga. It's treated like an afterthought, if it's acknowledged at all. That disconnect doesn't happen by accident. It happens because modern food culture rewards familiarity, shelf aesthetics, and supply chain convenience, not nutritional density or historical performance. When I say rutabaga fed Roman emperors, I'm not romanticizing the past. Roman agriculture relied heavily on hardy root vegetables that could survive cold storage, long transport, and inconsistent harvests. Rutabaga and its close relatives weren't luxury foods, but they were strategic foods. They provided calories, minerals, and crucial micronutrients when fresh fruit wasn't available. Armies marched on roots like this. Cities endured winters on them. And unlike fragile greens, rutabaga didn't collapse under pressure. It held. That resilience is exactly why it mattered then and why it should matter now. One thing I've learned after years in this space is that foods don't disappear because they stop working. They disappear because systems change. Industrial agriculture favors uniformity. Retail favors predictability. Marketing favors stories that can be simplified into slogans. Rutabaga doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. It's not pretty enough. It doesn't taste sweet enough without knowing how to cook it. And it doesn't lend itself to easy branding. So instead of being improved, it was quietly sidelined. If you've ever bought something just because everyone online swore it was next level, only to realize later it was overpriced and underwhelming, you already understand how this happens. Food hype works the same way. We chase what's visible. We ignore what's proven. And rutabaga is one of the clearest examples of that disconnect I've ever seen. From a practical standpoint, rutabaga is brutally efficient. It grows in poor soil. It tolerates cold better than most roots. It stores for months without refrigeration. And nutritionally, it punches far above its weight. Beyond vitamin C, it delivers potassium, fiber, and complex carbohydrates that release energy slowly instead of spiking blood sugar. When I compare it side by side with more popular roots, especially in budget-conscious diets, rutabaga consistently wins on cost per nutrient. That's not theory. That's math. What really changed my perspective, though, wasn't a spreadsheet. It was watching how people reacted once they actually learned how to use it. Most Americans who say they don't like rutabaga have never had it prepared properly. They've either had it boiled into oblivion or tasted it raw and written it off. That's like judging a steak based on jerky. Preparation matters. Context matters. And once you understand how this root behaves, how it caramelizes, how it absorbs fats, how it builds depth in stews, it stops being a survival food and starts being a secret weapon. Quick question for you because I'm genuinely curious. Have you ever dismissed a food just because you grew up hearing it was boring, old-fashioned, or poor people food? Drop it in the comments. Some of the most valuable foods I know fall into that exact category. There's also a deeper layer here that rarely gets discussed. Rutabaga wasn't just forgotten, it was replaced. As supply chains globalized, we started importing sweetness instead of cultivating resilience. We traded storage routes for year-round fruit. We traded local density for global variety. And in doing so, we became more dependent, not more nourished. Rutabaga represents a different philosophy of eating, one based on durability, sufficiency, and quiet reliability. That philosophy doesn't sell well in a culture addicted to novelty. If you want to look up the studies, the historical references, or even try sourcing rutabaga seeds or preparation guides yourself, I've linked solid resources in the description. No pressure, just tools if you want to go deeper. Once you get past the history and the shock factor, the real value of rutabaga shows up when you put it head-to-head with the vegetables Americans actually eat every week. Because theory is cheap, comparisons are where truth lives. I've watched people defend carrots, potatoes, and sweet potatoes like they're untouchable staples, and to be fair, each of those has its place. But when you strip away nostalgia and marketing and look strictly at performance nutrition per dollar, storage life, versatility, and consistency, rutabaga starts exposing some uncomfortable gaps. Let's start with the vitamin C issue because this is where most people get tripped up. Carrots have a reputation for being nutrient-dense, but in reality, they're modest when it comes to vitamin C. Rutabaga, by contrast, delivers roughly 4 times as much per comparable serving. That matters more than people think, especially in colder months when fresh fruit quality drops and processed food intake rises. Vitamin C isn't just about immune buzzwords. It plays a role in iron absorption, connective tissue repair, and stress regulation. When I look at diets that quietly fail over time, inadequate micronutrient density is almost always part of the problem. Rutabaga helps close that gap without supplements. Now compare rutabaga to potatoes, which are practically sacred in American kitchens. Potatoes are calorie efficient, but nutritionally they're fragile. They spike blood sugar faster, spoil more easily, and lose nutritional value quickly once stored improperly. Rutabaga, on the other hand, holds its structure. Its carbohydrates release more slowly. Its fiber content keeps digestion steady instead of volatile. For people trying to eat well on a budget, that stability matters more than raw calorie count. You stay full longer, you snack less, you waste less food. Sweet potatoes get even more praise, mostly because of their beta-carotene content and their association with clean eating. But here's what rarely gets mentioned. Sweet potatoes are picky. They need warmer climates, longer growing seasons, and better soil. They're also more vulnerable to spoilage. Rutabaga grows where sweet potatoes struggle. It stores where sweet potatoes rot. And while sweet potatoes win in sweetness, rutabaga wins in adaptability. It can go savory, neutral, or even slightly sweet depending on preparation. That flexibility is something I value highly because food that only works one way eventually gets boring, and boredom is the fastest path back to junk food. One mistake I see constantly is people treating rutabaga like a carrot substitute or a potato clone. It's neither. It behaves differently. It has a denser structure, a slightly peppery edge when raw, and a deeper flavor once cooked. When you respect that, everything changes. Roasted rutabaga with fat and salt develops a caramelized complexity that potatoes can match without added sugar. Mashed rutabaga, blended with a bit of butter or oil, delivers a richness that surprises people who expect blandness. And in soups or stews, it absorbs flavor without dissolving into mush, which is why it was prized historically in long-simmered dishes. Here's something else I rarely hear discussed. Rutabaga's strength isn't just nutrition, it's forgiveness. Overcook it slightly and it still holds. Store it a little too long, and it's still usable. Miss a watering cycle while growing it, and it adapts. That forgiveness is gold for real people living real lives. Not everyone has perfect kitchens, ideal schedules, or pristine produce bins. Foods that punish small mistakes don't last in practice, no matter how healthy they look on paper. Let me throw this question out there because it reveals a lot. Have you ever bought healthy produce that looked great at the store but went bad before you could even use it? Be honest. That frustration is exactly why durable foods matter more than trendy ones. Another layer most people miss is cost volatility. Carrots, potatoes, and greens fluctuate heavily with supply chain disruptions. Rutabaga tends to remain stable, especially when sourced locally or grown at home. I've seen years where rutabaga prices barely moved while other vegetables doubled. That kind of consistency isn't flashy, but it's powerful, especially for families, preppers, or anyone trying to reduce grocery stress. If you want to experiment with cooking methods or sourcing rutabaga affordably, I've linked a few practical guides and seed sources in the description. Nothing fancy, just things that actually work. If rutabaga is so efficient, so resilient, and so nutritionally solid, the obvious question is why it fell out of favor in the first place. And the answer has very little to do with taste or health. It has everything to do with perception, timing, and how food gets labeled once history moves on. I've seen this pattern repeat across dozens of ingredients over the years. And rutabaga is one of the cleanest examples of how a reliable food becomes a forgotten one, not because it failed, but because it became associated with survival instead of status. In the United States, rutabaga's reputation took its biggest hit during periods of scarcity. During wars, depressions, and supply disruptions, rutabaga showed up when other foods didn't. It was easy to grow, easy to store, and hard to kill. That made it a fallback crop. And fallback crops, unfairly, tend to get remembered as inferior. Once abundance returned, people wanted distance from anything that reminded them of rationing, struggle, or making do. Rutabaga got lumped into that category, even though it had fed people well long before hard times ever hit. This is a subtle but powerful force in food culture. When something becomes associated with poverty or necessity, it rarely gets rebranded later, unless someone can turn it into a luxury item. Kale escaped this fate because it could be dressed up, renamed, and marketed as elite wellness. Rutabaga never got that makeover. It stayed honest. And honesty doesn't always survive in a system that rewards image over function. There's also the issue of confusion. In the US, rutabaga is often mislabeled or misunderstood. Some people confuse it with turnips. Others don't know what to do with it once they bring it home. That uncertainty alone is enough to push shoppers towards safer, more familiar options. Grocery stores respond by stocking less of it. Less exposure leads to less demand, and the cycle continues. I've watched it happen in real time. From a grower's perspective, rutabaga is almost too good at what it does. It doesn't need heavy fertilizer. It doesn't demand perfect conditions. It doesn't produce flashy yields that photograph well. Industrial agriculture prefers crops that can be standardized, branded, and scaled aggressively. Rutabaga thrives quietly, which makes it a poor fit for modern profit models. That doesn't make it bad food. It makes it inconvenient for systems built around volume and speed. Here's something that might surprise you. In communities where food knowledge is passed down instead of outsourced to packaging, rutabaga never disappeared. It stayed in stews, it stayed in winter cellars. It stayed in rotation because it worked. Whenever I talk to older growers, homesteaders, or immigrant families from colder regions, rutabaga is treated with respect, not ridicule. That alone should tell you something. Have you ever noticed how foods only get called gross or boring after people forget how to cook them? That's not coincidence. Flavor is technique plus context. Remove the technique and the food takes the blame. Another factor that hurt rutabaga was the rise of convenience foods. Rutabaga requires prep. You peel it, you cut it, you cook it. It doesn't come pre-sliced in a plastic tray or frozen into a microwave-ready cube. As cooking skills declined and time pressure increased, foods that demanded a little more effort fell out of rotation. But here's the irony. Once you actually know how to use rutabaga, it is no more work than potatoes and often less frustrating because it holds its shape and doesn't turn to glue. What I find most telling is that rutabaga's nutritional profile never declined. The science didn't change. The only thing that changed was what we valued. We started chasing sweetness, softness, and speed. Rutabaga offers strength, density, and reliability. Those traits don't trend well on social media, but they matter deeply in real life. If this is starting to sound familiar, it's because the same thing happens with tools, skills, and habits. The flashy stuff gets attention. The dependable stuff gets ignored. Until it's needed again. This is where rutabaga either wins people over or gets written off for another generation. Because the truth is, most negative opinions about rutabaga aren't about the vegetable itself, they're about poor handling. I've seen this happen so many times it's almost predictable. Someone buys one out of curiosity, treats it like a carrot or an old potato, cooks it the same way they've always cooked everything else, and then decides it's bland or weird. That's not a fair test. And once you understand how rutabaga actually behaves, the entire experience changes. The first step is selection. A good rutabaga should feel heavy for its size. Weight matters because it tells you the root is dense, hydrated, and still alive, nutritionally speaking. The skin will usually be thick and slightly waxy, sometimes coated to prevent moisture loss. Don't let that throw you off. That wax is one of the reasons rutabaga stores so well. Look for firm roots with no soft spots, deep cracks, or sour smells. Surface scars are fine, softness is not. Storage is where rutabaga quietly outperforms most vegetables. Keep it in a cool, dark place and it will last for weeks, often months. Refrigeration helps, but it's not mandatory. This is one of those foods that doesn't punish you for imperfect conditions. I've pulled rutabagas out of storage that looked rough on the outside, but were pristine once peeled. That kind of reliability is rare. Now let's talk prep, because this is where most people go wrong. Rutabaga has a tougher skin than carrots or potatoes, and it needs to be peeled generously. Don't be shy. Under that skin is the part you want. Once peeled, the flesh is dense and slightly yellow. That density is a feature, not a flaw. It means it holds flavor and texture when cooked. One critical mistake is underseasoning. Rutabaga isn't sweet by default. It needs salt. It needs fat. Think butter, oil, or animal fat, whatever fits your diet. When roasted properly, rutabaga caramelizes in a way that surprises people who only associate sweetness with sugar. Cut it into even pieces, coat it lightly in fat, salt it well, and give it enough time in the oven. Rushing it is the fastest way to disappointment. Boiling is another area where rutabaga is unfairly judged. Boiled rutabaga isn't bad, but it needs finishing. Mash it with seasoning. Blend it with a bit of potato or cream if you want a softer texture. Use it as a base, not a standalone. Historically, rutabaga was rarely eaten plain. It was part of something soups, stews, mashes, where its role was to support and strengthen the dish, not dominate it. In soups and stews, rutabaga is at its best. It absorbs flavor without disintegrating. Long cooking times don't destroy it. That's why it was so valuable in the past and why it still makes sense today. If you're cooking something that simmers for hours, rutabaga belongs there. It builds body and depth in a way few roots can. Here's a pro-level tip most people never hear. Rutabaga improves with cold. A light frost during growing actually enhances its flavor, converting some starches into sugars. That's one reason late-season rutabagas often taste better. This is the opposite of fragile produce that degrades the moment conditions aren't perfect. Have you ever given up on a food after one bad attempt? Be honest. Most of us have. Rutabaga deserves a second look, especially when it's handled correctly. Another overlooked use is rutabaga as a partial replacement. You don't have to go all in. Swap it for half the potatoes in a mash, add it to a roast. Mix it into soups you already make. That gradual integration is how most people end up realizing they actually like it. And once it clicks, it sticks. If you want cooking references or basic prep guides for rutabaga, I've put a few practical ones in the description. Nothing fancy, just solid techniques that work. This is where the conversation shifts from preference to strategy, because liking rutabaga is one thing. Understanding why it matters in the real world is something else entirely. Over the years, I've watched people chase expensive powders, imported berries, and supplements that promise efficiency while quietly draining their budgets. And every time I run the numbers, honestly, cost, availability, shelf life, nutrient density, rutabaga ends up exposing how fragile a lot of modern health really is. Let's talk cost first, because this is where rutabaga is brutally honest. It's cheap, and it stays cheap. While prices on trendy produce spike with weather, fuel, or demand shifts, rutabaga tends to sit there unchanged. That's not accidental. It's because it grows in places other crops won't, stores without special infrastructure, and doesn't rely on constant refrigeration or rapid turnover. When food systems wobble, rutabaga barely notices. For anyone who's lived through supply disruptions, that stability is worth more than hype. Now compare that to imported superfoods. They look impressive on paper, but they're fragile. One shipping delay, one crop failure, one regulatory shift, and they disappear or double in price. Rutabaga doesn't vanish. It waits. That's a subtle difference, but it's a powerful one. Real nutrition isn't just about what's optimal in perfect conditions. It's about what's available when conditions aren't perfect. From a nutrient standpoint, rutabaga's vitamin C content becomes especially relevant here. Vitamin C degrades over time and with processing. Fresh, stored roots like rutabaga retain usable amounts far longer than many greens or fruits that start strong and then decline rapidly. That means what you actually consume over weeks and months can matter more than what a label claims on day one. I've seen people assume they're covered nutritionally, only to realize their food choices don't hold up outside ideal conditions. There's also a resilience factor most people don't calculate. Rutabaga can be grown at home with minimal inputs. No greenhouse, no complex systems, just soil, time, and basic care. That alone makes it one of the most accessible, nutrient-dense crops available. When people talk about food security, they often picture high-tech solutions. In reality, it usually comes down to a few reliable foods that refuse to fail. Here's a comparison that tends to change minds. For the cost of a single container of a powdered supplement, you can buy enough rutabaga to provide weeks of vitamin C, fiber, and calories without capsules, fillers, or marketing markup. And unlike supplements, rutabaga contributes to satiety. You feel fed. That matters more than most nutrition discussions acknowledge. Let me ask you this. Have you ever looked back at a grocery receipt and wondered how it added up so fast even when you ate healthy? That's not a personal failure. It's a system designed around convenience and novelty. Rutabaga sits outside that system. That's why it feels invisible and why it's so effective. Another overlooked advantage is waste reduction. Rutabaga doesn't demand perfect timing. You don't have to rush to use it before it spoils. That flexibility reduces food waste, which indirectly saves money and reduces stress. Foods that create pressure rarely survive long-term habits. Foods that wait patiently tend to stick. If you're curious about growing rutabaga, sourcing seeds, or planning storage, I've linked practical resources in the description. No survivalist drama, just grounded, proven information.